The items were collected. They were examined. And the laboratory work revealed something remarkable. There was DNA. There were partial fingerprints. Some of the fingerprints belonged to the victim. Others did not. Those unidentified prints belonged to someone who had touched the evidence. Someone who had been there. Someone who had left part of himself behind without knowing it. But in 1999, having a fingerprint was not the same thing as knowing whose fingerprint it was. Investigators submitted the available information to the systems then in use. The fingerprint searches produced no identification. The DNA profile was suitable for analysis. But when investigators compared it against the National CODIS database, there was no match. The evidence was real. The crime was real. The perpetrator was real. But the name was missing. And that is where a cold case begins. Not with the disappearance of evidence, but with the disappearance of answers. The investigators continued. They followed leads. They examined vehicles. They checked information from the public. They looked at sex offender registries. They pursued possible suspects. But nothing produced the name they needed. The unidentified fingerprint remained unidentified. The DNA remained unidentified. The girl returned home. Her family had survived a nightmare. But for investigators, the nightmare was not finished. Because somewhere out there was the person responsible. And he was free. For the community of Cairnbrook, the fear was immediate. For the investigators, the question was simple. Who was he? Nearly every cold case begins with that question. Sometimes the answer comes within days. Sometimes months. Sometimes years. And sometimes the evidence waits for technology to catch up with it. In Cairnbrook, the waiting would last almost 20 years. The fingerprint would sit inside a system that could not identify it. The DNA would sit inside another system that could not identify it. And the man who left them behind would continue living his life. Working. Moving. Growing older. Blending into ordinary society. While one small community carried the memory of a September afternoon that had changed everything. The case was not forgotten. But it was becoming older. And as the years passed, the original investigators faced the most difficult reality in criminal investigation. Evidence can survive. Memories can fade. Technology changes. People move. Databases grow. And sometimes the answer is not waiting in a new clue. It is waiting inside an old clue. A clue investigators have already collected. A clue they have already tested. A clue that simply needs another chance. For Cairnbrook, that chance would come nearly 20 years later. And when it did, it would begin with something so small that most people would never notice it. A partial fingerprint. Left behind on a brown paper bag. A mark made in seconds. A mark that survived for decades. And a mark that would eventually point directly toward a man who believed the past had disappeared. It had not. The past was still there. Waiting in the evidence room. Waiting in the databases. Waiting for technology to ask the question again. And nearly 2 decades after that September afternoon, investigators were finally going to ask, who does this fingerprint belong to? Part 2. The first investigation had everything that investigators could reasonably use in 1999. A living victim. Witnesses. A description. A vehicle. A crime scene. Physical evidence. DNA. Fingerprints. What it did not have was an identity. The man had managed to leave the most important thing behind. Evidence. But not a name. In the days after the kidnapping, Pennsylvania State Police and federal investigators pursued the case aggressively. Cars matching the description were stopped. Possible suspects were examined. Records were checked. Interviews were conducted. Every lead had to be taken seriously because the victim was a child and the possibility remained that the offender could strike again. The fear was not abstract. It had a face. It had a vehicle. It had happened in daylight. And it had happened in a community where people believed their children were relatively safe. That belief had been shattered in minutes. The victim's ability to guide investigators to the location of the assault became one of the most important elements of the case. She had been transported away from Cairnbrook. She had been taken across state lines. Yet she was able to help investigators identify the area where she had been assaulted. That meant investigators had a physical location to examine. And physical evidence could tell a story that memory sometimes could not. The brown paper bag became important. The napkins became important. The biological evidence became important. And the fingerprints became important. Laboratory specialists examined the recovered materials. The results were both promising and frustrating. A DNA profile could be developed. But there was no corresponding identity in Cody's. The fingerprint evidence was usable. But the available fingerprint system did not produce a match. Investigators had evidence of the person responsible. They simply did not know who that person was. This distinction matters. A cold case is not always a case without evidence. Sometimes it is a case with evidence that cannot yet be connected to a person. That was Cairnbrook. The evidence had survived. The databases had failed to provide an answer. So investigators kept working. But time changes investigations. The original case grows older.
Personnel change.
Technology changes. Priorities change. Yet some investigators never completely let go. One of them was Pennsylvania State Police Trooper Jeff Brock. Brock had worked the investigation from the beginning. Years later, even after his assignment changed, the case remained with him. That persistence would become one of the defining features of the investigation. Because the file was not simply an old report. It represented a child who had been taken, a family who had waited for answers, and a perpetrator who had never been identified. The passage of time could make a case look dormant. But dormant is not the same as dead. The DNA evidence eventually produced a breakthrough. In April 2004, the FBI laboratory reported that DNA from the Cairnbrook crime matched DNA from another kidnapping and sexual assault involving a minor girl in Hagerstown, Maryland, in September 1988. Suddenly, the Pennsylvania case was no longer isolated. The DNA connected it to another unsolved crime. Investigators now knew something crucial. The same unknown biological profile appeared in separate cases. The unknown offender had apparently operated in more than one location. The geography expanded. Pennsylvania, Maryland, and the investigation became larger. A second Maryland kidnapping and sexual assault from 1989 was eventually associated with the same offender through forensic evidence. The case was no longer simply about identifying the person who had taken a child from Cairnbrook. It was about identifying someone who appeared to have committed similar crimes over a period of years. But there was still no name. The DNA was telling investigators that the same person was connected to multiple crimes. The fingerprint was telling them that the person had touched physical evidence. Neither was telling them who he was. The years continued. The world changed around the investigation. Technology changed. The internet changed. Forensic science changed. People who had been children in 1999 became adults. The victim grew older. The suspect grew older. And somewhere in Maryland, a man continued living a seemingly ordinary life. That is one of the most unsettling aspects of a cold case. The investigation remains frozen in one moment. But the suspect does not. He keeps moving. He goes to work. He pays bills. He meets people. He develops routines. He builds an identity that has nothing to do on the surface with the crime investigators are still trying to solve. For nearly 2 decades, Timothy D. Nelson Jr. lived beyond the reach of investigators in the Cairnbrook case. There was no fingerprint match. No Cody's match.
No definitive identification.
The evidence had not failed. The technology had reached its limits. But those limits were not permanent. The FBI's fingerprint identification capabilities were changing. The old Integrated Automated Fingerprint Identification System, known as EAFIS, was eventually replaced by the Next Generation Identification System, or NGI. The new system could search a vastly expanded collection of biometric information. And that meant something important. Evidence that had produced nothing in 1999 could be worth looking at again. The old fingerprint was about to receive a second chance. In the fall of 2018, investigators submitted the partial prints recovered from the brown paper bag and napkin to the FBI's NGI system. This was not a new fingerprint. It was not newly discovered evidence. It was the same evidence, nearly 2 decades old. The difference was the system searching it. The technology had changed. The database had changed. And the answer changed with it. NGI returned a possible match. The name was Timothy David Nelson Jr., a man living in Cumberland, Maryland. For investigators, the moment was enormous. But a database hit was not enough. A possible match was not a conviction. It was not proof. It was a direction. The FBI laboratory had to confirm the fingerprint comparison. And the investigators had to determine whether the person behind the new biometric match was truly the same person connected to the Cairnbrook evidence. The old case had suddenly become active again. After nearly 20 years of silence, the investigation had a name. But the name raised another question. Who was Timothy Nelson? And why had his fingerprint been sitting on that brown paper bag since 1999? Part 3. For nearly 20 years, the answer had been buried inside a database. Not hidden in a secret location. Not locked inside a mysterious room. Not protected by some elaborate conspiracy. It was sitting inside a piece of evidence investigators had possessed almost from the beginning. The problem was simple. The technology of 1999 could not make the connection. The technology of 2018 could. That difference would change the entire case. When the Next Generation Identification System produced a possible match to Timothy David Nelson Jr., investigators did not simply declare the case solved. They moved carefully. The FBI laboratory confirmed that the partial fingerprints recovered from the brown paper bag and napkin matched Nelson. That transformed the investigation. Now the fingerprint was no longer an anonymous mark. It had a name. Timothy Nelson. A resident of Cumberland, Maryland. But investigators still needed biological confirmation. The case had DNA. The suspect had a fingerprint match. Now investigators needed to compare Nelson's DNA with the biological evidence recovered in Cairnbrook. The case that had once been cold was heating up. And the suspect was living less than 100 miles from the place where the investigation had begun. For years, the victim's attacker had existed only as an unknown man. A stranger. A vehicle. A description. Now investigators had a person. On January 7, 2019, a Pennsylvania arrest warrant was issued charging Nelson with offenses including kidnapping and aggravated indecent assault. A federal search warrant was also obtained for his DNA. The next day, January 8, Nelson arrived at the Cumberland City Police Department. The warrants were executed. And the man investigators had spent nearly 20 years trying to identify was finally in their custody. The case had moved from a forgotten fingerprint to an arrest in less than 48 hours. But the arrest was not the end. Forensic testing still had to answer the most important question. Was Nelson really the man whose DNA had been recovered from the Cairnbrook evidence? the FBI laboratory conducted the comparison. The result was decisive. Nelson's DNA matched the profile associated with the September 19, 1999 Cairnbrook kidnapping. The same biological evidence that had produced no identification in the late 1990s now connected directly to the man identified by the new fingerprint system. The fingerprint and the DNA were telling the same story. The suspect had been identified. But the investigation did not stop there. Remember the DNA match from 2004? The Cairnbrook evidence had already been connected to a September 1988 kidnapping and sexual assault of another minor girl in Hagerstown, Maryland. Now Nelson's DNA was compared with evidence from those other cases. It matched. A second Maryland case from 1989 was also connected to Nelson through DNA. The investigation had expanded from one Pennsylvania kidnapping to a pattern involving multiple victims across state lines. For investigators, the implications were profound. The man they had searched for since 1999 was not a ghost. He was a person who had continued living in ordinary society.
He had a job.
He had a home. He had a life. And for years, nothing in that ordinary life had alerted the world to the secret contained in the forensic evidence. That is what made the breakthrough so powerful. The fingerprint did not suddenly appear. It had been there all along. The DNA did not suddenly become more truthful. It had been there all along. What changed was the ability to connect those pieces to a human being. For the victim, the discovery had another meaning. For almost 20 years, one question could remain in the background. Who was he? Where did he go? Was he still alive? Did he remember? Would he ever be found? Cold cases create questions that can outlive the original headlines. The victim may grow older. The community may move on. But unanswered questions do not necessarily disappear. They simply become quieter. The investigators involved in the Cairnbrook case understood that. That is why the arrest was described not simply as a law enforcement victory. It was about closure. It was about the victim. It was about the other girls whose cases had been linked through DNA. And it was about the persistence required to keep evidence alive for nearly 20 years. The case also demonstrated something fundamental about forensic investigation. A fingerprint does not have an expiration date. Neither does DNA. What changes is the ability to interpret it. In 1999, the partial print had no name. In 2004, the DNA had no name. In 2018, the fingerprint technology produced a possible identity. In 2019, laboratory confirmation connected the suspect to the evidence. The timeline was almost surreal. The crime happened in 1999. The DNA connection to Maryland appeared in 2004. The fingerprint technology breakthrough came in 2018. The arrest came in January 2019. The guilty plea came in July. And in August 2019, nearly 20 years after the kidnapping, Timothy Nelson was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. The man who had once been unknown now had a name. The man who had once been unreachable was now behind bars. And the brown paper bag that seemed like trash had become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. But the story is not simply about technology. Because technology did not preserve the evidence by itself.
People did.
Investigators collected it. Laboratory specialists examined it. Troopers kept the case alive. Agents returned to old evidence. Analysts searched new databases. And someone had to believe that an unidentified fingerprint was worth another look. That belief mattered. Because cold cases are full of evidence that once seemed useless. A fingerprint without a match. A DNA profile without a name. A photograph without a face. A vehicle description without a license plate. At the time, investigators can only work with what the technology allows. But technology does not stop evolving. And neither should the investigation. The Cairnbrook case became an example of what happens when old evidence meets new capability. It also became a warning to offenders who believe time erases the past. It does not. A person can move. A person can change jobs. A person can cross state lines. A person can build a new life. But forensic evidence can remain exactly where it was left. Waiting. And when the technology catches up, 20 years can collapse into a single moment. A database search. A possible match. A laboratory confirmation. An arrest. And suddenly, the man who had spent nearly 2 decades outside the reach of investigators was no longer a mystery. He was Timothy Nelson.
Part 4.
The most haunting part of the Cairnbrook case was not the length of the investigation. It was the simplicity of the evidence. The perpetrator had left investigators something that could eventually identify him. A fingerprint. And yet that fingerprint could not speak. Not in 1999. It could only exist. It could only wait. The investigators who examined it had no way of knowing that nearly 20 years later, the same print would become the key to the case. This is where the story of Cairnbrook becomes more than a kidnapping investigation. It becomes a story about time. Time changes people. Time changes communities. Time changes technology. But evidence can remain frozen. The brown paper bag recovered after the assault was not important because it was valuable. It was important because someone had touched it. That contact created a permanent record. A ridge pattern.
A partiale impression.
A tiny biological signature of identity. The perpetrator probably never thought about it. Why would he? A paper bag is disposable. You use it. You throw it away. You forget it. But investigators did not forget it. They collected it. They preserved it. They tested it. And eventually they returned to it. The first fingerprint search failed. The second DNA search failed. Yet the evidence remained. The 2004 DNA match changed the investigation in another way. Investigators learned that the unknown perpetrator appeared to be connected to crimes in Maryland. That meant the Cairnbrook case was not an isolated mystery. The same biological profile had appeared in another kidnapping and sexual assault. The connection was powerful, but it also created frustration. Investigators knew the same person had been involved. Still, they did not know his name. Imagine knowing that one unknown individual had left biological evidence across multiple crime scenes. Imagine having a forensic profile that could connect cases separated by state lines. Imagine having the fingerprint of that same unknown person and still being unable to identify him. That was the reality for investigators for years. The technology could tell them that the evidence was connected. It could not tell them who the person was. The offender remained a silhouette. A name without a name. A fingerprint without an identity. A DNA profile without a face. The case entered the long shadow of time. But one investigator continued to remember. Trooper Jeff Brock had been involved from the beginning. For him, the Cairnbrook case was not simply a file number. He had seen the fear in the community. He knew what had happened to the child. He knew the investigation had never truly ended. That persistence is difficult to measure. There is no dramatic photograph for it. No flashing police lights.
No courtroom applause.
It is simply the decision to keep remembering a case after the rest of the world has moved on. 20 years is a long time. Children become adults. Parents become grandparents. Police officers retire. Investigators transfer. Evidence rooms change. Databases are replaced. But the questions remain.
Who did it?
Where is he? Will we ever know? The Cairnbrook case eventually answered those questions through technology. But the technology only worked because investigators had preserved the evidence long enough for that technology to become useful. This is one of the most important lessons of modern cold case investigation. An investigation does not always need a new clue. Sometimes it needs an old clue viewed through a new system. The FBI's next-generation identification system represented exactly that kind of change. When investigators submitted the partial fingerprints again in the fall of 2018, they were essentially asking the evidence the same question they had asked years earlier. Who does this belong to? The answer was different because the database was different. The system produced a possible match. Timothy David Nelson Jr. The name immediately changed the investigation. A cold case became an active case. A faceless suspect became a living person. And the investigators moved. Within months, the fingerprint match was confirmed. The DNA evidence was tested. The biological profile matched Nelson. And the case that had once seemed almost impossible to solve became prosecutable. But the emotional weight remained. For the victim, the discovery meant that the stranger who had taken her had finally been identified. For the investigators, it meant that the evidence they had protected for years had finally fulfilled its purpose. For the community, it meant that the person responsible was no longer an unknown threat. And for Nelson, the past had finally caught up. There is a particular cruelty in the way cold cases return. They do not announce themselves. There is no warning. A person may believe that the old crime has disappeared. Then a phone call comes. A database produces a result. A laboratory confirms a match. A warrant is issued. And the past becomes the present. For Nelson, that moment came in January 2019. He arrived at a police department in Cumberland, Maryland. He was no longer an anonymous suspect. He was a named defendant. And the case had evidence. The fingerprint. The DNA. The testimony. The forensic connections to other crimes. The investigation that had begun in a Pennsylvania community in 1999 had finally crossed the threshold into the courtroom. But there was still one question that mattered. Would Nelson admit what he had done? In July 2019, the answer came. He pleaded guilty in federal court to kidnapping and aggravated sexual abuse of a person under 12. The plea removed the need for the victim to endure a full trial. The case had reached its legal conclusion. But the emotional conclusion was more complicated. No sentence could erase September 19, 1999. No courtroom could return the lost years. No prison term could make the memory disappear. Justice and closure are not the same thing. A conviction can answer who. It can answer what happened in legal terms. It can remove a dangerous person from society. But it cannot rewrite the past. That is why the fingerprint matters. Not because it is dramatic. Not because it is large. Not because it looks extraordinary. But because it survived. A tiny mark made during an act that lasted only seconds became evidence that lasted decades. The offender could leave Pennsylvania. He could cross state lines. He could change his life. But he could not change the fingerprint. And he could not change the DNA. Those two silent witnesses waited until investigators had the technology to understand them. Part 5. When investigators finally identified Timothy Nelson, the case changed from a mystery into a timeline. September 19, 1999. The kidnapping in Cairnbrook. The trip into West Virginia. The assault. The release of the child. The recovery of the brown paper bag and napkins. The fingerprint examination. The DNA examination. The failed database searches. April 2004. The DNA connection to a Maryland case. The years of waiting. Fall 2018. The fingerprint submitted again. January 2019. The arrest. July 2019. The guilty plea. August 2019. The sentence. 20 years had passed between the beginning and the end. But the forensic evidence had been there almost from the beginning. The public often imagines cold cases as investigations where police have nothing. Cairnbrook demonstrates something different. Investigators had something. They simply did not have enough to identify the person. That distinction is critical. The evidence was not weak because it was old. It was limited because forensic databases in 1999 were limited. The fingerprint was real. The DNA was real. The unidentified person was real. But the systems used to search for him had boundaries. As those systems improved, the boundaries moved. The FBI's newer biometric capabilities allowed investigators to search the partial fingerprints again. This time, the result was different. The system pointed toward Nelson. The FBI laboratory then confirmed the match. The fingerprint became the bridge between a 20-year-old crime and a living suspect. But the case did not depend on a single piece of evidence. The DNA provided an independent forensic connection. The evidence from Cairnbrook had already been associated with the unknown offender through Cody's in 2004. Now Nelson's DNA matched that profile. The two forensic paths converged. Fingerprint. DNA. Same person. Same crime. The investigation had finally reached a point where uncertainty could give way to prosecution. There was also another revelation. The DNA linked Nelson to crimes in Maryland. That meant investigators were not looking at an isolated event. They were looking at a series of crimes connected through forensic evidence. For nearly 20 years, the victims had carried questions. Now investigators could identify the man responsible. The legal system moved quickly. Pennsylvania issued an arrest warrant. Federal authorities obtained a DNA search warrant. Nelson was taken into custody. The process that had taken 20 years to begin moved rapidly once the forensic identity was established. That contrast is striking. 2 decades of uncertainty. Days of action. It shows how much of a cold case investigation can depend on a single breakthrough. Before the fingerprint match, investigators could search. After the fingerprint match, investigators could act. Before the name, there was suspicion. After the name, there was a suspect. Before the suspect, the case was an unanswered question. After the suspect, the evidence could be tested directly. And when the DNA confirmed the connection, the case became nearly impossible for the defense to explain away. Nelson eventually pleaded guilty. The plea also spared the victim from the ordeal of a full trial. That consideration was important. The original crime had already taken enough from her. A trial could have forced her to revisit the events in public. The guilty plea allowed the legal process to reach its conclusion without requiring the victim to relive every detail before a jury. The sentence followed. 30 years in federal prison. The number is significant. But numbers can never capture the full human cost of a crime involving a child. The sentence represents punishment. It also represents the fact that the legal system finally recognized the seriousness of what had happened. For nearly 20 years, there had been no courtroom ending.
No defendant. No sentence. No certainty.
Then suddenly there was. The case was closed. But the word closed can be misleading. A case can be closed legally while remaining emotionally open. The victims still had memories. The community still had memories. Investigators still remembered the original search. The paper bag still carried the story of what happened. And the fingerprint remained the silent link between the past and the present. There is something almost symbolic about that fingerprint. A person can hide behind distance. A person can hide behind a new address. A person can hide behind an ordinary job. But a fingerprint does not know how to lie. It does not know how to forget. It does not know that 20 years have passed.
It simply says,
I was here. That is why forensic evidence can be so powerful in cold cases. It does not depend entirely on memory. It does not become emotional. It does not change its story. It waits. And in Cairnbrook, the evidence waited long enough. The case also demonstrated the importance of cooperation between agencies. Pennsylvania State Police worked with the FBI. The FBI laboratory examined DNA and fingerprints. Maryland authorities became involved because the forensic evidence connected the Pennsylvania case to crimes in Hagerstown. Different jurisdictions had pieces of the same puzzle. The evidence connected them. Without the DNA connection, the Maryland cases might have remained separate. Without the fingerprint breakthrough, the Cairnbrook case might have remained unidentified. Without investigators preserving the evidence, neither development would have mattered. Cold cases are rarely solved by one dramatic moment alone. They're solved by accumulation. One piece of evidence. One database. One laboratory. One investigator. One new technology. One old clue. Until finally the pieces align. And when they do, the person who believed the years had erased the crime discovers something terrifying. Time did not erase the evidence. It only made the evidence older.
Part 6.
For the people of Cairnbrook, September 19, 1999, was not just another date. It became a dividing line. Before that afternoon, children could walk together without the fear that a stranger might suddenly stop beside them. After that afternoon, every parent understood that the world could change in seconds. The community was small. The crime was enormous. And the shock traveled quickly. A child had been taken from the street. The suspect was unknown. The vehicle was gone. The search expanded. Police were everywhere. Questions spread faster than answers. Who was the man? Where had he gone? Was he still nearby? Would he return? Could another child be targeted? These are the questions that transform a crime into a community trauma. And because the suspect was not identified, the fear did not have a clear endpoint. There was no arrest to reassure people.
No courtroom. No sentence.
Only an open investigation. That is what made the case so difficult. An unknown offender creates uncertainty. An identified offender creates accountability. For nearly 20 years, Cairnbrook had uncertainty. The case was investigated. The evidence was preserved. The DNA was entered into the appropriate databases. The fingerprint was searched. But nothing produced a name. Then came the 2004 breakthrough. DNA from another Maryland case matched the Cairnbrook profile. For investigators, it was both progress and frustration. They had proven that the same offender was connected to multiple crimes.
But they still could not identify him.
Imagine the contradiction. They knew more about the offender's forensic identity than they did about his actual identity. They could tell the biological evidence belonged to the same person. They could connect cases across states. But the man himself remained out of reach. That is the strange logic of cold cases. Sometimes the evidence knows more than the investigators. The evidence can tell them. This was the same person. But it cannot immediately tell them. This is his name. For years, that was the situation. Then the technology changed. The FBI's next-generation identification system expanded the possibilities of fingerprint identification. Investigators revisited the old evidence. The brown paper bag returned to the center of the case. A partial print was submitted. And the system produced a possible match. Timothy Nelson. Suddenly, the old investigation had a new direction. But the name alone was not enough. Investigators had to establish whether Nelson was truly the person connected to the evidence. That is why the forensic confirmation mattered so much. The FBI laboratory confirmed the fingerprint match. Then DNA analysis confirmed Nelson's connection to the Cairnbrook evidence. The case had become scientifically coherent. Two separate forms of forensic identification pointed to the same person. The possibility became certainty. The unknown offender had been identified. The investigation that had started with a child's disappearance now had a defendant. For the victim, that moment was about more than forensic science. It was about finally knowing. For years, an unanswered question could follow someone through life. Who was the person who did this? Where did he go? Was he living nearby? Did he have a family? Did he remember? The arrest did not erase those questions, but it answered the most important one. Who? Timothy Nelson. That name had been absent from the case for almost 20 years. Then it appeared everywhere. In police documents, in court records, in federal proceedings, in the news. The transformation was complete. The anonymous offender had become a defendant, and the evidence that made it possible had been collected decades earlier. That is why the story of Cairnbrook is not simply a story about a criminal. It is a story about the patience of evidence. Evidence does not become impatient. It does not demand immediate recognition. It remains what it is. A fingerprint remains a fingerprint. DNA remains DNA. A piece of physical evidence remains a piece of physical evidence. The question is whether investigators will eventually possess the tools to interpret it. In 1999, they did not. In 2018, they did. The difference was enough to solve a 20-year-old crime. The case also demonstrates why preserving evidence is essential. Had the paper bag been discarded because it seemed insignificant, the fingerprint might never have been available for a later search. Had the DNA not been preserved, the 2004 connection to Maryland might never have occurred. Had investigators stopped looking after the first database failures, the case might have remained open indefinitely. Instead, the evidence was protected. The investigation survived. And eventually the technology caught up. That is the quiet reality behind many cold case breakthroughs. There is no magic. There is no mysterious confession from nowhere. There is a file. There are boxes. There are laboratory reports. There are databases. There are investigators who keep asking the same question. And sometimes the answer arrives years later. Cairnbrook became one of those cases. The community had waited. The victim had grown older. The investigators had continued. And the evidence had remained silent. Until one day it was no longer silent. The fingerprint spoke. The DNA confirmed it. And the case finally moved toward justice.
Part 7.
The courtroom ending came in 2019. But the real story had begun 20 years earlier. When Timothy Nelson pleaded guilty, he admitted responsibility for the Cairnbrook kidnapping and sexual assault. The plea meant there would be no prolonged trial.
No jury deliberación.
No long sequence of witnesses forced to reconstruct every moment. The victim and her family had already lived with the consequences for years. The guilty plea brought the legal process to a conclusion. Then came the sentence. 30 years in federal prison. The number was immediately reported. But behind that number was a much longer timeline. Nearly 20 years of uncertainty. Nearly 20 years of unanswered questions. Nearly 20 years during which the perpetrator was not publicly identified. And nearly 20 years during which the evidence waited. That is why the phrase cold case can be misleading. Cold does not mean inactive forever. It means unresolved. A case can remain cold for years and then become active again in a matter of days. That is exactly what happened here. In the fall of 2018, the old fingerprint was resubmitted. By January 2019, Nelson was arrested. By July, he pleaded guilty. By August, he was sentenced. The legal resolution moved with extraordinary speed compared with the years of silence that came before it. The turning point was not a confession. It was not a new witness. It was not a dramatic discovery at the original crime scene. It was technology. More specifically, it was the ability to search old fingerprint evidence against a more advanced biometric system. The FBI's NGI system produced the possible match. Laboratory confirmation followed. Then DNA confirmation followed. The case was solved because the old evidence finally found a modern database. That is a powerful lesson. Forensic science is not static. A failed search in 1999 does not necessarily mean a failed search forever. A fingerprint that cannot be identified today may be identifiable tomorrow. A DNA profile without a match may become a match years later when another sample enters a database. Every new entry changes the possibilities. Every new technology changes the questions investigators can ask. And every new case can potentially help solve an older one. That is what happened in Cairnbrook. The 1999 DNA profile eventually connected to the 1988 Maryland case. Then the identity of the person behind the profile was finally established through fingerprint and DNA evidence. The old crimes and the new investigation became one story. The same forensic signature crossed years and state borders. Pennsylvania. Maryland. Different victims. Different locations. One offender. For investigators, that connection provided a broader understanding of what had happened. For the public, it raised an uncomfortable question. How could someone connected to multiple crimes remain unidentified for so long? The answer lies partly in the technology of the time. In 1999, forensic databases were not what they are today. The fingerprint system had limitations. The DNA database had limitations. There were fewer records, fewer digital connections, fewer opportunities for automated comparison. A fingerprint could exist without producing a name. A DNA profile could exist without producing a name. The evidence was powerful, but the system surrounding it was smaller. As the databases expanded, the probability of finding a match increased. The offender could not control that. He could only hope that the evidence would never connect. But evidence does not need permission. It simply waits for the right comparison. The final investigation also showed the value of cross-jurisdictional cooperation. Pennsylvania authorities had the original case. Maryland authorities had related cases. The FBI had the federal databases and laboratory capabilities. The cases became connected because the forensic evidence crossed state borders. The victim had been taken from Pennsylvania. The assault occurred in West Virginia. The DNA connected the case to Maryland. The suspect was living in Maryland. The investigation crossed geography repeatedly. The evidence was the thread holding everything together. And that thread was not visible to the public. For years, people could only see separate cases. Separate victims. Separate states. Separate investigations. The DNA saw the connection first. Then the fingerprint gave that connection a name. That is what made the final breakthrough so powerful. It was not one piece of evidence replacing another. It was multiple pieces finally agreeing. Fingerprint. DNA. Location.
Timeline.
Investigative history. Everything converged. The case that had once seemed frozen suddenly had direction. And the man who had lived under his own name for decades was finally forced to confront the evidence left behind under a different set of circumstances. A brown paper bag. A partial fingerprint. Biological evidence. Small things. Ordinary things.
But they survived.
That is why the Cairnbrook case still carries an unsettling message. A person may believe that the past becomes less dangerous with every passing year. But from an investigative perspective, time can work in the opposite direction. Every year brings new technology, new databases, new comparisons, new forensic methods, new opportunities to revisit old evidence. The clock does not always protect the offender. Sometimes it works against him.
Part 8.
There is another layer to the Cairnbrook case that is easy to overlook. The investigation was not solved by the technology alone. It was solved because someone had preserved the possibility of a solution. That possibility existed in the evidence room. It existed in the case file. It existed in the DNA profile. It existed in the partial fingerprint. And it existed in the memory of investigators who refused to consider the case permanently lost. Trooper Jeff Brock had worked the case from its beginning. Even after moving to another assignment, he remained connected to the investigation. That kind of persistence rarely appears in headlines.
Headlines per fer dramàtic moments.
An arrest. A confession. A conviction. But the long years between those moments are where cold case investigations are actually built. The interviews. The records. The evidence. The databases. The follow-ups. The waiting. The decision to reopen an old file. The decision to submit an old print again. The decision to ask a laboratory for another comparison. Every one of those steps can look insignificant until the day they produce a name. The Cairnbrook fingerprint was not newly created in 2018. It was nearly 19 years old when investigators submitted it to NGI. The system did not discover a new crime. It discovered an old identity. That distinction is important. The technology did not change the evidence. It changed the ability to read the evidence. And that is one reason cold cases continue to be investigated. Science advances. Databases grow. People who were invisible to one system may become visible to another. The case of Timothy Nelson is an example of that principle in action. The first fingerprint search did not identify him. The first DNA database search did not identify him. But those failures were not meaningless. They established that the evidence had been examined. They created a forensic record. They preserved the possibility of future analysis. Then the 2004 DNA match connected the Cairnbrook case to Maryland. That development was crucial. It showed investigators that the unidentified offender had appeared in another case. The mystery became larger. But larger did not mean solved. The name remained absent. For another 14 years. Then the fingerprint system changed the equation. The possible match to Nelson was followed by laboratory confirmation. The DNA then provided further confirmation. The unknown person had become an identifiable suspect. The suspect had become a defendant. The defendant became a convicted offender. That progression is the backbone of the entire case. And yet, for the victim, the legal language cannot describe everything that happened. A court can establish facts. A sentence can impose punishment. A guilty plea can acknowledge responsibility. But none of those things can restore the ordinary childhood that was interrupted in Cairnbrook. That is why investigators repeatedly emphasized closure. Closure does not mean forgetting. It means uncertainty has an answer. It means the victim no longer has to wonder whether the offender will ever be identified. It means the community no longer has to imagine an unknown person moving through the area. It means the investigation can finally be placed into history. The case also demonstrates the importance of the victim's actions. She was able to guide investigators to the location where physical evidence was recovered. That evidence became essential. Without it, there might have been no fingerprint. Without the fingerprint, the later NGI search might not have happened. Without the DNA, the connection to Maryland might not have been established. Without the combined evidence, the prosecution would have been different. In other words, the victim's ability to help investigators reconstruct the events became part of the forensic chain that ultimately identified Nelson. That is significant. In many investigations, victims are spoken about only as the people harmed. But their information can be crucial to the investigation. In Cairnbrook, the victim's memory helped investigators find evidence. The evidence survived. The technology improved. And the evidence eventually helped identify the offender. The chain stretched across decades. A child's memory. A paper bag. A laboratory. A database. A fingerprint. DNA. A warrant. An arrest. A guilty plea. A sentence. Each link depended on the one before it. Break one link, and the story might have ended differently. The case is therefore not simply a story about a criminal being caught. It is a story about a system slowly assembling an answer. And it shows why investigators continue to preserve evidence from unresolved cases. Because no one knows what tomorrow's technology will make possible. In 1999, the fingerprint was a dead end. In 2018, it became a lead. In 2019, it became evidence against a named defendant. The fingerprint did not become better. The world around it became better at recognizing it. That is the terrifying lesson for anyone who believes that time automatically erases a crime. Time may erase memories. It may erase buildings. It may erase records. But if physical evidence survives, time can also become the offender's enemy. Every new database entry is another opportunity. Every improved forensic system is another possibility. Every new laboratory method is another door. The evidence waits behind those doors. And sometimes, decades later, someone finally opens one. Part 9. The story of Cairnbrook could have ended very differently. The fingerprint could have remained unidentified forever. The DNA profile could have remained an anonymous code in a database. The victim could have grown older without ever learning the identity of the person who abducted her. The community could have carried an unanswered question for the rest of its history. That possibility existed. For almost 20 years, it was reality. Then the technology changed. The FBI's next-generation identification system created an opportunity that did not exist in the same form in 1999. Investigators took the old evidence and ran it again. That decision changed everything. The possible fingerprint match to Nelson was the first major breakthrough. But investigators still had to confirm it. The FBI laboratory did. Then the DNA comparison followed. It matched. The fingerprint had found the name. The DNA backed it up. The legal case could move forward. Nelson was arrested in January 2019. The arrest itself represented the collapse of nearly 2 decades of uncertainty. For investigators who had worked the case from the beginning, it was the moment they had waited for. For the victim, it was a moment that could not undo the past, but could finally answer the question of who was responsible. For the community, it meant the unknown offender was no longer unknown. And for cold case investigators everywhere, it demonstrated the value of revisiting evidence. The phrase old evidence can be misleading. Old does not mean useless. Old does not mean inaccurate. Old simply means it has been waiting. The Cairnbrook evidence had waited since 1999. The DNA connection had waited since 2004. The fingerprint match came in 2018. The arrest came in 2019. The timeline reveals something remarkable. The solution was not hidden in a brand new clue. It was already in the original evidence. The breakthrough came because investigators were able to look again. That is one of the reasons modern cold case investigations can suddenly move after decades. Technology creates new possibilities. Databases expand. Fingerprints can be searched against more records. DNA profiles can be compared with more individuals. Information from different jurisdictions can be connected. A case that once had no apparent path forward can suddenly have several. In Cairnbrook, The forensic trail eventually led to Nelson. But the investigation also exposed the importance of patterns. The DNA did not only solve one case. It connected the Cairnbrook evidence to crimes in Maryland. That meant the investigation had implications beyond Somerset County. The unknown offender had crossed state lines. The victims were different. The locations were different. But the forensic signature was the same. That kind of connection is one of the most powerful tools in criminal investigation. A single case may have too little information. Several connected cases can reveal a pattern. A pattern can reveal an offender. And once an offender is identified, investigators can go backward through old cases and ask a different question. Where else does this person appear? The Cairnbrook investigation demonstrates that forensic evidence can operate like a thread through time. The thread begins at one crime scene. It moves to another. It crosses a state line. It enters a database. It disappears for years. Then it emerges again. And eventually it reaches a person. That person is no longer an unknown. He has an address, a history,
A name.
and a legal identity. Timothy Nelson. The case that had once been described as unsolved was no longer unsolved. The cold case had been broken. But the phrase nearly 20 years still matters. Because 20 years is enough time for an entire generation to change. A 10-year-old victim becomes an adult. The investigators who first worked the case become older. The community changes. Technology transforms. The suspect ages. And yet the original evidence remains. That is why the brown paper bag has such symbolic power.
It was ordinary.
Disposable. Forgettable. But it carried something extraordinary. A fingerprint. A biological trace. Evidence that survived the years. The perpetrator may have thought he was leaving nothing behind. He was wrong. He left a record. And the record waited. There is a natural human tendency to believe that unresolved cases belong to the past. A crime happens. The investigation begins. The headlines fade. Life continues. But for victims and investigators, the case does not necessarily end. It becomes part of the background. A question waiting for an answer. A file that can be reopened. A box that can be examined again. The Cairnbrook case proved that this process can work. It also showed that justice can arrive in a form nobody could have predicted in 1999. The breakthrough was not immediate. It was not dramatic. It was technological. A fingerprint was searched again. A possible match appeared. The laboratory confirmed it. DNA confirmed the connection. And the legal system took over. The result was not a mysterious disappearance. It was an identification. Not a permanent cold case. A solved one. The fingerprint had finally spoken.
Part 10.
When Timothy Nelson was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison in August 2019, the legal chapter of the Cairnbrook case came to an end. But the emotional story continued. Because justice is not a time machine. It cannot return the victim to September 18, 1999. It cannot erase the moment when the vehicle stopped. It cannot erase the fear. It cannot erase the years of uncertainty. It cannot give back the childhood that existed before the crime. What justice can do is something different. It can establish responsibility. It can remove the offender from society. It can acknowledge the harm. And it can tell the victim, "We believe you. We found him." The man who did this is no longer a mystery. For investigators, that mattered enormously. The case had remained unresolved for nearly 2 decades. The evidence had survived multiple technological generations. The investigators had followed the trail from Pennsylvania to Maryland. And eventually the suspect was found living in Cumberland. The arrest was the moment when the long investigation finally became visible to the public. News reports spread. The story returned to the headlines. The same case that had once terrified Cairnbrook was suddenly everywhere again. But this time the headline was different. The suspect had been identified. The cold case had been solved. The fingerprint had betrayed him. The story of the paper bag became central because it represented the entire investigation. Something discarded became evidence. Something ignored became important. Something unidentified became decisive. And something almost 20 years old became the key to an arrest. That is what makes forensic evidence so compelling.
It does not need to be dramatic.
It only needs to be preserved. The smallest object can become the largest clue. The case also demonstrates how investigations can benefit from patience. The first fingerprint search did not work. The first DNA search did not work. The evidence was not discarded because the databases produced no answer. Instead, it remained available. That decision created the possibility of a future breakthrough. When the FBI's newer system became available, investigators had something to submit. The evidence had survived long enough to meet the technology. And the result was extraordinary. A possible fingerprint match. Timothy Nelson. That name led to a laboratory confirmation. Then the DNA confirmation. Then the arrest. Then the guilty plea. Then the sentence. The entire chain began with something almost invisible. A partial fingerprint. The case also became a reminder that a perpetrator's own actions can create the evidence that eventually identifies him. Every contact can leave something behind. Every crime scene can contain information. A person may try to control what investigators see. But physical evidence can record what the person never intended to reveal. The offender does not get to choose which details survive. That is why investigators collect everything. Because what seems insignificant today may become critical tomorrow. The paper bag was not a dramatic piece of evidence. But it was enough. The fingerprint was partial. But it was enough. The DNA profile had no match in the beginning. But it was preserved. That was enough. Time did not destroy the case. It delayed the answer. And there's a difference. For almost 20 years, the answer existed somewhere in the evidence. Investigators simply could not reach it. Once they could, the case moved rapidly. The story also shows how important it is to connect databases. The DNA evidence linked Cairnbrook to Maryland. The fingerprint linked the evidence to Nelson. Together, those systems turned separate fragments into a single investigative picture. Without that integration, the crimes might have remained isolated. Instead, investigators could see that the same offender was associated with multiple cases. That broadened the understanding of what had happened. It also gave the victims something they had not had before: an identity. The name Timothy Nelson transformed the cases. The victims were no longer waiting for an unknown stranger to be found. They knew who had been responsible. The legal system could respond. And society could impose a sentence. 30 years. A number that represented the seriousness of the crimes. A number that meant Nelson would spend a significant portion of his life behind bars. But even after the sentence, the story does not become simple. Because the true end of a cold case is rarely the moment the judge says the sentence. For the victim, healing is not measured in years. For the investigators, the memory of the original case remains. For the community, the story becomes part of local history. And for everyone who studies cold cases, Cairnbrook becomes an example of what can happen when evidence is preserved and technology advances. The fingerprint was never lost. The DNA was never lost. The case was never truly gone. It was waiting. And the moment the right technology arrived, the silence ended. Part 11. Nearly 20 years after a 10-year-old girl was taken from a street in Cairnbrook, the man responsible was finally identified. Not because someone suddenly remembered his face. Not because a stranger walked into a police station with a confession. Not because investigators discovered a hidden weapon. The breakthrough came from something far smaller. A fingerprint. A partial fingerprint left on a brown paper bag. A mark that had been sitting in evidence since 1999. For years, it meant almost nothing. Then technology changed. The fingerprint was searched again. The system produced a possible match. The laboratory confirmed it. DNA confirmed it again. And the name that investigators had searched for nearly 2 decades finally appeared. Timothy David Nelson, Jr. The unknown offender was no longer unknown. He was arrested in January 2019. He pleaded guilty in July. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison in August. The legal mystery was over. But the memory of Cairnbrook remains. The case began in a quiet Pennsylvania community. 3 children were walking together. A vehicle appeared.
It passed.
It returned. It stopped. A man approached. A question was asked. Then a child was taken. In that instant, an ordinary afternoon became a crime scene. A community was transformed. A family was forced into an ordeal no parent should ever face. And investigators began a search that would last almost 20 years. They searched vehicles. They interviewed people. They followed leads. They examined forensic evidence. They entered DNA into databases. They searched fingerprints. Again and again, the answer refused to appear. Then the DNA made a connection in 2004. The Cairnbrook evidence matched another kidnapping and sexual assault case in Maryland. The investigation expanded. But the identity remained unknown. 14 more years passed. Then, in the fall of 2018, investigators returned to the fingerprint. The new NGI system searched the partial prints. This time, there was a possible match. The evidence had not changed. The fingerprint had not changed. Only the technology had changed. That is the detail that should remain with anyone listening to this story. The evidence was waiting. For 19 years. For almost 2 decades, a tiny mark on a disposable object carried the identity of the person who had committed the crime. The offender could not erase it. He could not move it. He could not change it. He could only hope it would never be matched. But eventually it was. And that is the true ending of the Cairnbrook case. Not a perfect ending. Not a happy ending. But an answer. The victim knew who had been responsible. Investigators knew the case had been solved. The community knew the unknown offender was no longer free. And the evidence had finally done what evidence is supposed to do. It told the truth. The case also leaves behind a larger lesson. Cold cases do not always need a new witness. They do not always need a new confession. Sometimes they need investigators to return to what they already have. A fingerprint. A DNA profile. A photograph. A piece of clothing. A document. An old database entry. Something collected years ago may become valuable when the science catches up. Cairnbrook is proof. In 1999, the fingerprint was anonymous. In 2018, it became a possible identification. In 2019, it helped put a defendant in court. That is the strange relationship between crime and time. The offender may believe time is an ally. But time can change the balance. Technology improves. Databases expand. Old evidence is revisited. New connections appear. And the past can return without warning. For Timothy Nelson, that return came after nearly 20 years. For the victim, it meant that the question that had followed her for years finally had an answer. For investigators, it meant that persistence had not been wasted. And for the community, it meant that the case that once seemed destined to remain unresolved had finally reached a conclusion. The brown paper bag had looked ordinary. The fingerprint had looked insignificant. The database had once returned nothing. The DNA had once returned nothing. Yet none of those failures erased the truth. They only delayed its discovery. Somewhere inside the evidence, the answer had been waiting. And when investigators finally found the right way to ask the question, the evidence answered. Who did this? Timothy Nelson. Where was the proof? On the evidence recovered after the assault. How long had investigators waited? Nearly 20 years. And what finally broke the silence? A fingerprint. A fingerprint that the offender never expected anyone to recognize. A fingerprint that survived the years. A fingerprint that outlived the original investigation. A fingerprint that crossed from one technological era into another. And finally, a fingerprint that pointed directly to the man investigators had been searching for since September 19, 1999. The story of Cairnbrook is therefore not truly about a perfect crime. It is about a crime that only appeared to be beyond reach. It is about evidence that refused to disappear. It is about investigators who refused to forget. It is about technology that eventually became powerful enough to connect an anonymous mark to a human being. And above all, it is about a victim who had to wait far too long for an answer. Nearly 2 decades passed. The world changed. The community changed. The technology changed. The suspect changed. But the fingerprint remained.
Silent.
Patient. Waiting. And when the moment finally came, it said exactly what investigators needed to hear. He was here. And now they knew who he was. The cold case was no longer cold. The mystery was no longer a mystery. The fingerprint had spoken. And after nearly 20 years of silence, the man who thought the past was behind him finally discovered that the past had been waiting for him all along. The first investigation had everything investigators could reasonably use in 1999. A living victim. Witnesses. A description. A vehicle. A crime scene. Physical evidence. DNA. Fingerprints. What it did not have was a name. The man had managed to leave investigators something that could eventually identify him. Evidence. But not an identity. In the days after the kidnapping, Pennsylvania State Police and federal investigators moved quickly. Cairnbrook was no longer simply a quiet community in Somerset County. It was now the center of a desperate search for a child who had been taken from the street in broad daylight. Every possible lead mattered. Every vehicle matching the description had to be examined. Every suspicious person had to be considered. Every piece of information from the public had to be checked. But the investigation faced a terrifying problem. The suspect was already gone. He had taken the child away from Pennsylvania. He had crossed state lines. And investigators did not know where he was going. The victim was eventually released and recovered in West Virginia. She was alive. That fact changed everything. She could talk. She could describe what had happened. She could help investigators reconstruct the route. And critically, she could help them locate the area where the assault had occurred. Investigators followed her directions. They searched. They examined the scene. And they found physical evidence. Among the items recovered were a brown paper bag and napkins. To an ordinary person, they might have looked like garbage. To a criminal investigator, they were potential witnesses. Every object at a crime scene can contain information. Every surface can carry a trace. Every contact can leave a mark. The items were collected and preserved. The laboratory examination produced something investigators desperately needed. DNA. A biological profile could be developed from the evidence. But there was an immediate problem. The profile had no name. Investigators submitted it to the National DNA Database. No match. The result was frustrating. They had a biological signature belonging to the offender, but the database could not tell them who that person was. The fingerprint evidence presented the same problem. Partial prints were recovered. They were examined. They were searched through the fingerprint system available at the time. Again, there was no identification. The evidence existed. The perpetrator existed. But the connection between the two did not. For investigators, that meant the case remained open. And for the community, the uncertainty continued. Parents watched their children more closely. People remembered the vehicle. They remembered the descriptions. They remembered the sudden disappearance that had turned an ordinary Pennsylvania afternoon into a nightmare. But as the years passed, the headlines became less frequent. The investigation did not disappear. It simply became quieter. That is what happens to many cold cases. The first weeks are filled with urgency. The first months are filled with searches and interviews. Then the years arrive. Files become thicker. Evidence becomes older. Investigators move to new assignments. New cases demand attention. But somewhere inside the system, the unresolved case remains. Cairnbrook remained. The unidentified fingerprint remained. The unidentified DNA remained. And the victim's memory remained. Then in April 2004, the case changed. The FBI laboratory reported that DNA from the Cairnbrook investigation matched DNA from another kidnapping and sexual assault involving a minor girl in Hagerstown, Maryland, dating back to September 1988. For investigators, the development was enormous. The unknown offender was now connected to another case. The DNA was telling them something that the fingerprint database could not. The same person had apparently been involved in crimes separated by years and state lines. Pennsylvania. Maryland. Different victims. Different locations. The same forensic signature. But there was still no name. The DNA could connect crimes. It could not identify the man behind them. Investigators now understood that they were dealing with a broader pattern. The question was no longer simply, who kidnapped the girl in Cairnbrook? It had become something much larger. Who was the person behind this DNA profile? Where was he? How many cases could be connected to him? And how long had he been doing this? Another Maryland case from 1989 would later be connected to the same offender through DNA. The evidence was building, but the identity remained hidden. For years, investigators had to live with that contradiction. They knew more and more about the offender scientifically, yet they knew almost nothing about him personally. They had his DNA. They had his fingerprint. They had evidence from multiple crime scenes. They had descriptions from victims. And still, no name. The suspect remained a ghost. Not because he had left no evidence. Because the evidence had nowhere to go. Then the world of forensic identification began to change. The FBI's fingerprint identification capabilities evolved. The old EAFI system was eventually replaced by the next-generation identification system, known as NGI. The new system could search a much larger collection of biometric information. That meant old evidence could potentially produce new answers. And investigators began looking backward. The Cairnbrook fingerprint had never disappeared. It had simply remained unidentified. The same partial print recovered nearly 20 years earlier could now be searched through a far more advanced system. In the fall of 2018, investigators submitted those old prints again. The question was exactly the same. Who does this belong to? But this time, the system had more information. More records. More capability. More possibilities. Then the screen produced something investigators had been waiting nearly 20 years to see. A possible match. The name was Timothy David Nelson Jr., a man living in Cumberland, Maryland. For the first time, the anonymous fingerprint had a potential identity. The investigation suddenly had a direction. But investigators knew better than to rush. A database hit is not automatically proof. A possible fingerprint match must be examined and confirmed. The FBI laboratory conducted the comparison. The result was decisive. The partial fingerprints recovered from the brown paper bag and napkin matched Nelson. The old evidence had finally produced a name. But investigators still had another question. Was the DNA also his? That question mattered. Because the case contained more than one form of forensic evidence. The fingerprint had identified a possible suspect. The DNA could independently establish whether that person was connected to the crime. Investigators obtained a warrant for Nelson's DNA. They were about to compare a man living in Maryland with biological evidence collected almost 20 years earlier. The distance was enormous. The time gap was enormous. But forensic evidence does not care about distance. It does not care about birthdays. It does not care how many times a person has moved. It simply asks whether the biological profile matches. And when the comparison was made, the answer was clear. Nelson's DNA matched the DNA associated with the Cairnbrook kidnapping. The fingerprint had pointed toward him. The DNA confirmed him. Two independent forensic paths had converged on the same person. The investigation that had begun in 1999 was suddenly moving at extraordinary speed. On January 7, 2019, a Pennsylvania arrest warrant was issued. The charges included kidnapping and aggravated indecent assault. A federal search warrant was also obtained for Nelson's DNA. The next day, Nelson arrived at the Cumberland City Police Department. The warrants were executed. The man investigators had spent nearly 20 years trying to identify was finally in custody. The arrest was not the result of a new crime. It was the result of an old crime catching up with him. The evidence had waited. The investigators had waited. The technology had changed. And finally, the name was known. But there was another disturbing revelation. The DNA did not connect Nelson only to Cairnbrook. It connected him to other cases. The same biological profile had already linked the Cairnbrook evidence to Maryland. Now investigators had the person behind that profile. A case that had once seemed isolated was part of a much larger forensic picture. For nearly 2 decades, Nelson had lived outside the reach of investigators. He had a home, a routine, a life. Nothing about his ordinary existence could erase the evidence from 1999. That is the terrifying lesson of the Cairnbrook investigation. Time can make a crime seem distant. But physical evidence does not experience time the way people do. A memory can fade. A witness can forget. A neighborhood can change. A building can disappear. But a fingerprint can remain a fingerprint. DNA can remain DNA. And if investigators preserve those pieces long enough, technology may eventually turn them into an identity. The brown paper bag had been almost worthless when it was discarded. In 1999, it carried only a partial print. In 2018, that print carried a name. And that name led investigators directly to Timothy Nelson. Nearly 20 years had passed. But the evidence had never forgotten. And now the man connected to it had nowhere left to hide. The arrest in January 2019 did not happen because investigators suddenly discovered a new witness. It did not happen because Timothy Nelson walked into a police station and confessed. And it did not happen because someone finally remembered a face from 1999. It happened because an old fingerprint had survived long enough to meet a new generation of forensic technology. But an identification is only the beginning. Once investigators had Nelson's name, they had to prove that the man standing in front of them was the same man whose biological evidence had been collected nearly 20 years earlier. The stakes were enormous. For almost 2 decades, the Cairnbrook case had remained unresolved. Now there was a suspect. But investigators could not afford to rely on a single database hit. They needed confirmation. They needed science. They needed the evidence from 1999 to speak again. The first voice had come from the fingerprint. The second would come from DNA. The original evidence had been collected after the victim was recovered in West Virginia. She had been able to direct investigators toward the location where the assault occurred. That information had allowed police to recover physical evidence that might otherwise have been lost forever. Among that evidence were the brown paper bag and napkins. The objects appeared insignificant, but they carried the traces of the offender. Years earlier, investigators had developed a DNA profile from the evidence. The profile was entered into Cody's. Nothing. No name.
No suspect.
No match. But the profile did not disappear. It remained in the system. Then, in 2004, it produced an important connection. The DNA from Cairnbrook matched DNA from a separate kidnapping and sexual assault case in Hagerstown, Maryland, dating back to 1988. The discovery changed the scope of the investigation. The unknown offender was no longer connected to one crime. He was connected through forensic evidence to another. The biological evidence suggested a pattern. And another Maryland case from 1989 would also become connected to Nelson through DNA. Investigators now had multiple victims, multiple locations, multiple years. One unidentified biological profile. Still, they had no name. That was the central frustration. The science could tell investigators that the same man was connected to the crimes, but it could not tell them who that man was. For years, the investigation remained suspended in that space between knowledge and identification. Then came 2018. The old fingerprint evidence was submitted to the FBI's next-generation identification system. The system was designed to search a much broader biometric database than the fingerprint technology available in 1999. The result was a possible match to Timothy David Nelson Jr. The name immediately changed the case. Investigators now had a person to investigate. Nelson lived in Cumberland, Maryland. He was no longer an abstract suspect. He was a real individual with an address, a history, and a life that could be examined. Investigators moved quickly. But the old evidence still had to be tested against the new suspect. The FBI laboratory confirmed that the partial fingerprint recovered from the Cairnbrook evidence matched Nelson. That was a major breakthrough. But investigators did not stop there. They obtained a warrant for a DNA sample from Nelson. The question was brutally simple. Would the DNA match? If it did, the two independent forensic trails would converge. The fingerprint had already pointed toward Nelson. The DNA could establish whether he was biologically connected to the crime. The laboratory comparison was performed, and the result was decisive. Nelson's DNA matched the DNA recovered in connection with the 1999 Cairnbrook kidnapping. After nearly 20 years, the unknown offender had a name. And now investigators had two powerful forms of forensic evidence pointing toward the same person. Fingerprint. DNA. The combination transformed the investigation. The man who had existed for years as an unidentified offender in police files was now Timothy Nelson. The arrest warrant followed. On January 7, 2019, Pennsylvania authorities issued a warrant charging him with kidnapping and aggravated indecent assault. A federal search warrant was also obtained for his DNA. The following day, Nelson arrived at the Cumberland City Police Department. The warrants were executed. The investigation had finally reached the moment investigators had been waiting for since 1999. The suspect was in custody. But the story was still not finished, because investigators now had the opportunity to examine the broader pattern. The DNA evidence had already connected Cairnbrook to the 1988 Hagerstown case. Now that Nelson had been identified, authorities could associate a name with the biological profile. The anonymous offender was no longer anonymous. The Maryland cases could be connected to a person. The Pennsylvania case could be connected to the same person. What had once looked like separate investigations had become part of a single forensic story. And that story stretched across decades. The first crime occurred in 1988. Another followed in 1989. Then came the Cairnbrook kidnapping in 1999. The biological evidence connected the cases. But the identity of the offender remained hidden until the fingerprint breakthrough nearly 20 years after Cairnbrook. That timeline is difficult to comprehend. A child was kidnapped. The offender left forensic evidence. Investigators collected it. The laboratory developed DNA. The database produced no identification. Years later, the DNA connected the crime to another case. Still no name. More years passed. Then the fingerprint was searched again. A name appeared. And within months, that name became a defendant. This is why the phrase cold case can create the wrong impression. Cold does not mean forgotten. It does not mean abandoned. It does not mean there is no evidence. Sometimes it means the evidence is waiting for the technology to catch up. Cairnbrook was exactly that kind of case. The investigators had done the work in 1999. They had collected the evidence. They had preserved it. They had tested it. But the technology available at the time could not complete the final connection. The later breakthrough did not replace the original investigation. It completed it. And that distinction matters. Modern forensic science is often portrayed as something that suddenly solves an old mystery. But behind every breakthrough is an earlier decision to preserve evidence. Without the paper bag, there would have been no fingerprint. Without the fingerprint, there would have been no NGI comparison. Without the biological evidence, there would have been no DNA confirmation. Without the victim's ability to help investigators locate the assault scene, the physical evidence might never have been recovered. Every part of the case depended on another part. That is how cold cases survive. Not through luck alone. Through evidence. Through persistence. Through the belief that an unanswered question can still have an answer. For Nelson, the passage of time had apparently created distance between himself and the crime. But investigators saw something different. They saw a fingerprint. They saw DNA. They saw a connection. And they knew the evidence had not forgotten. On the day Nelson was taken into custody, nearly 20 years of uncertainty began to collapse. The community could finally put a face to the unknown offender. The victim could finally know who was responsible. Investigators could finally close one of the longest-running mysteries in their files. But for the victim, identification could never erase what had happened. The arrest could not return the missing years. The guilty plea could not undo the fear. The sentence could not rewrite September 19, 1999. Justice could punish. It could establish accountability. It could provide an answer. But it could not make the crime disappear. That is the painful truth behind almost every cold case breakthrough. The evidence can solve the mystery. It cannot erase the memory. And yet, after years of uncertainty, knowing the identity of the offender can carry enormous significance. For nearly 20 years, the question had been hanging over the case. Who was he? Now there was an answer. Timothy David Nelson, Jr. The fingerprint had spoken. The DNA had confirmed it. And the investigation had finally reached the courtroom. But the next stage would reveal something even more important. Nelson would have to face the evidence publicly. And the case that had remained silent for almost 2 decades would finally be heard in a federal courtroom. The courtroom was now waiting for the man whose name had been missing from the case for nearly 20 years. Timothy David Nelson Jr. was no longer an unidentified suspect hidden inside an old investigative file. He was a defendant. The fingerprint had given investigators his name. The DNA had connected him to the crime. And now the legal system had to determine what would happen next. For the victim, this was not simply another stage in an investigation. The case had begun when she was 10 years old. By the time Nelson was arrested, she was an adult. Almost 20 years had passed between those 2 points. 2 decades of memories. 2 decades of unanswered questions. 2 decades in which the person responsible had remained unidentified. The arrest changed that. But an arrest is not justice by itself. Investigators still had to present the evidence. Prosecutors still had to establish the case. And Nelson still had the right to defend himself. The evidence, however, was formidable. There was the original physical evidence. There was the fingerprint recovered from the brown paper bag and napkin. There was the DNA profile developed from the evidence. There were the later DNA connections to other cases. And there was the FBI laboratory's confirmation that the fingerprint matched Nelson. The forensic trail had become extraordinarily difficult to ignore. The evidence had started in Pennsylvania. The DNA connection reached Maryland. The fingerprint identification eventually led investigators to Cumberland. The investigation had crossed state lines because the offender had crossed them first. The case therefore became part of a federal prosecution. The charges were serious.
Kidnapping.
Aggravated sexual abuse of a child. The legal language was cold. The reality behind those words was not. A 10-year-old girl had been taken. The crime had altered her life. The community had lived with the uncertainty. And investigators had spent years carrying an unanswered question. Now that question had a name. Timothy Nelson. The prosecution did not need to rely on a dramatic confession. The evidence had already created a chain. The fingerprint connected Nelson to physical evidence recovered after the assault. The DNA connected Nelson to the biological material. And the same DNA profile had connected the Cairnbrook case to other crimes. The science was doing what investigators had hoped it would do for years. It was converting an unidentified offender into a specific person. The defense could challenge evidence. The legal process could examine the circumstances. But the forensic results had already transformed the case. And then came another decision. Nelson chose to plead guilty. In July 2019, he pleaded guilty in federal court to kidnapping and aggravated sexual abuse of a person under 12. The plea was significant for several reasons. First, it formally acknowledged responsibility. Second, it removed the uncertainty of a trial verdict. And third, it spared the victim from having to endure a prolonged courtroom trial. For someone who had already spent years carrying the memory of the crime, that mattered. The case had already forced her to relive the past through investigators, forensic examinations, and legal proceedings. A full trial could have required her to revisit those events again in public. Instead, the guilty plea brought the case closer to an ending. But the sentence still remained. The court would determine how many years Nelson would spend in prison. And on August 15, 2019, that answer arrived. 30 years in federal prison. 30 years. The number stood at the end of a timeline that had begun almost 20 years earlier. For investigators, the sentence represented accountability. For the victim, it represented the legal recognition that what happened to her was real, serious, and criminal. For the community, it meant the person responsible was finally removed from society. But 30 years cannot measure the true impact of a crime against a child. A sentence can count years. It cannot count fear. It cannot count lost trust. It cannot count the nights when a family wondered whether the offender would ever be found. It cannot count the years spent waiting for an answer. And it cannot erase the memory of that September afternoon. That is why cold case investigations are often so emotionally complicated. People sometimes imagine that solving a case means everything returns to normal. It does not. The crime remains part of the victim's history. The community remembers. Investigators remember. The evidence remains in the files. What changes is the uncertainty. Before the arrest, there was an unknown offender. After the arrest, there was a known offender. Before the plea, there was a pending prosecution. After the plea, there was an admission of guilt. Before the sentence, there was uncertainty about punishment. After August 2019, there was a 30-year federal sentence. The unanswered questions had been reduced. And the fingerprint that had waited nearly 20 years had finally completed its journey. But there was another reason the prosecution was important. The Cairnbrook evidence had not only identified Nelson. It had helped connect him to other crimes. The DNA evidence from Cairnbrook had already matched the biological evidence from the 1988 Hagerstown kidnapping and sexual assault. Another Maryland case from 1989 was also connected through DNA. That meant the Cairnbrook investigation helped reveal a broader pattern. The forensic evidence had crossed state lines long before investigators knew the offender's name. The DNA had essentially been telling investigators, "This is the same person." For years, that was all it could say. Then the fingerprint gave the DNA a face. That is the remarkable part of the story. The evidence did not suddenly appear in 2018. It had been sitting there since the crime. The fingerprint had been sitting there. The DNA had been sitting there. The difference was that investigators finally had the technological ability to connect those clues to Nelson. The case therefore became an example of why evidence preservation matters so much. A case may not be solvable today. That does not mean it will never be solvable. Technology changes. Databases expand. New forensic methods emerge. Old fingerprints can be searched again. Old DNA profiles can be compared against new records. The evidence from one case can be connected to another. And sometimes, those connections reveal an offender who has remained unidentified for years. Cairnbrook demonstrates that process with almost painful clarity. 1999. The crime occurs. The evidence is collected. The fingerprint produces no match. The DNA produces no match. 2004. The DNA connects Cairnbrook to Maryland. Still no name. Years pass. 2018. The old fingerprint is searched through NGI. A possible match appears. Timothy Nelson. 2019. The fingerprint is confirmed. The DNA is confirmed. Nelson is arrested. He pleads guilty. He receives 30 years. A case that had once seemed frozen has reached its legal conclusion. And yet, the most unsettling question remains. What if investigators had not preserved the paper bag? What if the fingerprint had been discarded? What if the DNA had not been collected? What if the evidence had not been stored? What if investigators had decided, after years without a match, that nothing more could be done? The answer might never have come. The case might have remained unsolved. The victim might never have known the identity of the man who abducted her. The community might have carried the uncertainty indefinitely. That is why the smallest decision in an investigation can become the most important decision years later. Collect it. Preserve it. Test it. Store it. Revisit it. Because nobody knows what technology will exist tomorrow. In 1999, the fingerprint was a dead end. In 2018, it was a breakthrough. The evidence had not changed. The future had. And that is the final irony of the Cairnbrook case. The man responsible had nearly 20 years to believe the crime belonged to the past. But the crime never truly belonged to the past. It remained present in a laboratory, present in a database, present in an evidence box, present in the memory of investigators, present in the life of the victim, and most importantly, present in the fingerprint he left behind. He could move. He could age. He could build another life.
But he could not move that fingerprint.
He could not age it. He could not convince it to disappear. It remained exactly where he left it, waiting. And when the technology finally became capable of reading it, the fingerprint did what the offender never expected. It gave investigators his name: Timothy Nelson. Nearly 20 years after Cairnbrook. Nearly 20 years after the child was taken. Nearly 20 years after the paper bag was left behind. The evidence finally betrayed him. And the case that had once been defined by an unknown man was finally defined by an identified offender, a guilty plea, and a 30-year federal sentence. The silence had lasted nearly 2 decades. The answer took only one fingerprint to begin speaking. For nearly 20 years, the Cairnbrook case existed in a strange space between evidence and identity. Investigators knew a crime had happened. They knew a child had been taken. They knew the offender had left physical evidence behind. They knew biological material connected the case to other crimes. But they did not know the one thing every investigation ultimately needs:
A name.
Without a name, the evidence could only point toward an unknown person, an unknown fingerprint, an unknown DNA profile, an unknown offender. That was the reality from 1999 until the breakthrough in 2018. But the story of those missing years is important because the case never truly stopped moving. It simply moved beneath the surface. The evidence continued to exist. The databases continued to grow. And investigators continued to wait for an opportunity. The original investigation had been built around the victim's account. She had survived. She could describe the abduction. She could tell investigators what happened. And she could help them identify the location where the assault occurred. That location became critical. Investigators searched it carefully. They recovered physical evidence. Among the items were a brown paper bag and napkins. At first, there was nothing visually extraordinary about them. They were ordinary objects, the kind of objects people use and throw away without thinking. But crime scene investigators do not look at objects the way ordinary people do. They ask a different question. Who touched this? Why was it here? Could it contain a fingerprint? Could it contain DNA? Could it establish a connection? In this case, the answer was yes. The physical evidence contained traces that could eventually become central to the investigation. The laboratory developed a DNA profile. The profile was submitted to Cody's. No match. The fingerprint evidence was examined.
No identificación.
The case remained open. The evidence was preserved. And then the years began to accumulate. 1 year became 5. 5 became 10. 10 became 15. The case was aging, but the evidence was not becoming irrelevant. Then came 2004. The FBI laboratory discovered that the DNA profile from the Cairnbrook case matched biological evidence from a 1988 kidnapping and sexual assault involving another minor girl in Hagerstown, Maryland. For investigators, this was a major development. It confirmed that the unknown offender was connected to another crime. The Cairnbrook case was no longer an isolated investigation. There was now a forensic bridge between Pennsylvania and Maryland. The unknown offender had left the same biological signature in separate cases. The implication was disturbing. The person investigators were searching for had apparently been active for years. The DNA was providing a pattern. But it still did not provide an identity. Investigators could say the same person was responsible. They could not say who that person was. Another Maryland case from 1989 would later be linked through DNA as well. The evidence was becoming stronger. The identity remained absent. That contradiction defined the case. The science knew the offender existed. The databases knew the biological profile existed. Investigators knew the crimes were connected. But nobody could attach a name to the evidence. This is the frustrating reality of forensic cold cases. People often imagine DNA as an instant answer. It is not. DNA can establish that biological evidence belongs to a particular person. But if that person's DNA is not already in a searchable database, the profile may remain unidentified. The same is true for fingerprints. A fingerprint can be highly individual. But if investigators cannot compare it against a matching record, it remains an unidentified impression. The evidence can be scientifically powerful and practically incomplete at the same time. That was Cairnbrook. The offender had left evidence. He had simply not left his name. And as the years passed, the investigation entered a period of silence. The victim continued her life. The community continued its life. The investigators continued theirs. But the case remained. Then forensic technology began changing rapidly. Fingerprint identification systems were becoming more sophisticated. Databases were expanding. The FBI's next-generation identification system offered investigators capabilities that had not existed when the original investigation began. That created a new opportunity.
Go back.
Look again. Search the evidence again. The partial fingerprints from Cairnbrook were not discarded. They had been preserved. And now they could be submitted to a much more advanced system. In the fall of 2018, investigators did exactly that. The old fingerprint was searched again. The question had not changed. Who left this behind? But the system had changed. The database was larger. The technology was more capable. The possibilities were different. Then a possible match appeared. Timothy David Nelson, Jr., a man living in Cumberland, Maryland. For investigators who had spent years looking at an anonymous fingerprint, the name must have been a dramatic moment. But it was not yet the end. A possible match was only the beginning of the final stage. The FBI laboratory examined the prints. The comparison confirmed that the partial fingerprints recovered from the evidence matched Nelson. The anonymous mark finally had an owner. But investigators still had one more major piece of evidence: DNA. They needed to determine whether Nelson's biological profile matched the DNA recovered from the Cairnbrook investigation. A search warrant was obtained. Nelson's DNA was collected. The laboratory comparison was performed. And the result confirmed what investigators had begun to suspect. Nelson's DNA matched the profile associated with the Cairnbrook crime. The case had changed completely. The fingerprint had identified him. The DNA had corroborated the identification. The unknown offender was no longer unknown. And because the same DNA profile had already been connected to Maryland cases, investigators could now place a name behind those forensic links. The significance was enormous. For years, the case had been a collection of evidence. Now it had a suspect. A suspect who could be arrested. A suspect who could be prosecuted. A suspect who would have to answer for what happened. The arrest came quickly. On January 7, 2019, Pennsylvania authorities obtained an arrest warrant charging Nelson with kidnapping and aggravated indecent assault. The following day, Nelson arrived at the Cumberland City Police Department. The warrants were executed. He was taken into custody. Nearly 20 years had passed since the crime. But the arrest happened because the evidence had never stopped existing. The fingerprint had been waiting. The DNA had been waiting. The investigators had been waiting. And suddenly, the case was moving. There was another remarkable detail in the timeline. The DNA connection to Maryland had been known since 2004. That means investigators had known for years that the Cairnbrook offender was connected to other crimes. But until the fingerprint breakthrough, they could not attach a name to the biological profile. For 14 years, The DNA knew something investigators did not. It knew the cases were connected. It knew the same person had left the evidence.
It simply could not say who.
Then the fingerprint answered the question. Timothy Nelson. The case demonstrates the power of combining forensic systems. DNA can connect crimes. Fingerprints can identify individuals. When both point toward the same person, the investigative picture becomes dramatically stronger. One piece of evidence may generate a lead. Two independent forensic pathways can transform that lead into a compelling identification. That is exactly what happened here. The old case was no longer dependent on memory alone. It did not depend entirely on a description from 1999. It did not depend on someone recognizing Nelson decades later. It depended on physical evidence. Evidence collected close to the time of the crime. Evidence preserved for years. Evidence that survived long enough to be analyzed by newer technology. And that is why the paper bag matters so much. It was never meant to become evidence. It was never meant to sit inside a laboratory. It was never meant to help solve a case. It was simply something the offender touched. That brief contact created a permanent record. The offender left. The paper remained. The years passed. The fingerprint remained. And eventually, the fingerprint became the bridge to his identity.
There is a certain irony in that.
People often imagine that criminals are caught because they make one huge mistake.
Sometimes they are.
But sometimes the mistake is microscopic. A fingerprint. A strand of DNA. A trace on an object. A contact so brief that the offender never notices it. The person leaves believing nothing remains. But something does. And if investigators preserve it, the evidence can wait longer than the offender expects. Nearly 20 years after Cairnbrook, that waiting ended. The fingerprint pointed toward Nelson. The DNA confirmed the connection. The warrants were issued. The arrest followed. And the case that had spent years in the shadows was suddenly back in the headlines. But one final stage remained. The courtroom would have to hear the story. The victim would finally see the person responsible identified in public. And the man who had remained outside the reach of investigators for nearly 2 decades would have to confront the evidence he had left behind. Not just the fingerprint. Not just the DNA. But the entire chain of events that had followed him across time. A chain he could not break. Because every year he had survived without being identified had not erased the evidence. It had only allowed the evidence to become older. And sometimes, old evidence is the most dangerous evidence of all. It has already survived the first investigation. It has already survived the passage of time. And if it survives long enough, it may eventually meet the technology that can finally reveal what it has been saying all along. This was the moment Cairnbrook had been waiting for. The evidence had a name. The name had an address. And the address led investigators to the man who had spent nearly 20 years believing the past was somewhere behind him. It wasn't. The past had been waiting inside a paper bag.